Hello, and welcome to the first official video episode of Autistic Mic Drop with me, Rian Reyes. Today's topic is going to be obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is going to be more anecdotal. A lot of it's going to be me talking about my personal experiences, as well as some of my favorite media iterations of obsessive-compulsive disorder, more than it's going to be like a medical definition of obsessive-compulsive disorder. So to start off with, how I explain it to people so that they understand is essentially obsessive-compulsive disorder is personal superstition. It's a superstition that you've created for yourself. Because you're worried about this bad thing happening, you do something ritualistic to prevent it. And it could be manifested in a few different ways. Some of it comes from internalized trauma, like something happened that was very traumatic and it affected your personality from that point on. It can be more habitual, like an example, when I was little, I used to bump my head into cabinets a lot. So now I get really uncomfortable when I see cabinet doors open and I have to make sure that they're all closed in a single room. Or it can be what's known as intrusive thoughts, which can usually come from stress or anxiety disorders. I made a TikTok about it. If you punch it, it'll stop it. The thought pops in your head, you're not supposed to do that. So when that happens, you suddenly grab your hand as if you're stopping yourself from punching it. That's an example of an obsessive compulsion that's not ritualistic or habitual, but it is based on your anxiety and your internal superstition. Some of the things I've dealt with as far as my obsessive compulsive disorder, first of all, is the disbelief that I have it. A lot of people only know the media interpretations that they've seen. Two of the biggest movies were Matchstick Men and As Good as It Gets. In those iterations, it has a lot to do with cleanliness and numbers, and that can be part of it. But and this is part of what I want to get into. A lot of interpretations of OCD only focus on the side effects or the manifestations of OCD rather than what causes OCD or what fuels it. And that can be a bit frustrating. It leads to a lot more misinterpretation. People think that someone with OCD is just broken and they're doing this thing to be weird because they don't understand that it's not weird. Or that's a bad way to phrase it. But I get a lot of people who think that it's just extreme germophobia, and it's not it. You know what I mean? People found out that Howie Mandel has germophobia and obsessive compulsive disorder, and they just accepted that as a quirk about this celebrity, but nobody knows why he has germophobia. And personally, I don't remember the original story, but he didn't always have it. It was something that hit him really hard, and then he suddenly shaved his head and stopped shaking people's hands for a very long time. And so that's why it can be frustrating. People see me and it's I can be forgetful. I paint and I get stains on my shirt, and sometimes it takes me forever to wash the shirt. Or sometimes I get a stain on my arm and I don't realize it, so I go the whole day without washing my hands because I'm forgetful. And so people assume that, well, there's no way you could have OCD, you're messy. And it's that's the thing, that's not what OCD is. OCD is a coping mechanism. To give a personal example of mine, when I was maybe 6 or 7, I was driving with my mom, and I forget where we were going. We were going to or from daycare or school or something, but I was driving with her. And I think that at this time, we didn't live in the same city that I went to school in, so it was a commute. And so we were on the freeway, and I suddenly have the urge to open the door. So it starts off as an intrusive thought, is I have a sudden urge to open the door. Normally, as soon as I get into the car, my mom locks all the doors. And I'm not blaming her, but it's so I got used to that. So whenever I had that urge, I would just appeal to it, and nothing would happen because the door was locked. One day, the door wasn't locked, and I opened it, and I leaned out a little bit, and it scared me, and I quickly closed it again, and I got in trouble for it. And ever since then, I remember the feeling of almost falling out of a moving car. So when I'm on the highway, I get very anxious about the door opening suddenly, so I have to lock it and hold on to the handle above the window. That's one of the more things that it's based more in trauma, but it started with an intrusive thought. Another thing is I have ADHD, so a lot of my habitual obsessive compulsions have to do with me making mistakes. Like, regardless of if I use the kitchen or not, whenever I leave my house, I have to check all of the knobs on the oven, because one day I left it on, and then me, my mom, and my brother went to the movies, and I suddenly remembered that I left it on, and my mom had to go all the way home while we watched the movie, and I literally almost started a fire in my house. I think that covers all three. So now I want to talk about most iterations that I've seen. As I said, only focus on the trauma part of it, like the manifestation of the OCD. And because of that, you get a very like quirky character, and you never really get to feel like that character is a person. And I feel like that's what creates distance for itself. One example that I enjoy because of how they handled the trauma that comes from having OCD is the show Monk. It's much more, not reasonable, it's still quirky, it's still played for laughs, but it's a much more analyzing of how he has to interact with the rest of the world. Like, even though every character gets frustrated with him, they also acknowledge, like, this is something he has to live with. He doesn't know why he's like this for the most part. And it's something that he can't help. And it's something that he's actively working on, but it's a thing that, like, until he's comfortable to a certain extent, he's, like, always going to be like this. And it's incredible. There's even an episode where he has to come to terms with being disabled. Someone's trying to find a loophole for him to get back onto the police force, and they use the Disability Act, which means that people can't be discriminated against because of their disability. And so the thing about that episode is that means that he has to recognize that what he has is a disability, because up until that point, the show only plays it as this is his personality, this is just how he is. They've never really accepted that this is like a thing that's, you know, not that it's not normal, but it's a thing that's affecting him externally as much as it is internally. Like, it's not just how he is, it's a thing he lives with. The flip side of that is the show never outright says that he has obsessive compulsive disorder or autism, but he's very clearly disabled coded to have both. And that can be very frustrating. Like, he'll get into situations where in reality, it may not exactly work out for him, but it would be a lot more understandable of a situation if he just said out loud that he has OCD. Like, there's an episode where he's going to jury duty, and he thinks because of his OCD that he won't be accepted because of all the things that he needs accommodated. But when he gets there, the judge doesn't understand what he's trying to explain, and so the judge denies him any accommodation, and that's like played off as a joke. But the issue with that for me as someone with OCD is like, it would have been a lot more realistic if he had said outright that he has a disability, that he needs these accommodations because he has OCD, and that's why he's asking for the accommodations. But instead, it's just the judge just gets frustrated with him and tells him to just be quiet and do what he's been called to do, and then he ends up on jury duty anyway. And that happens a couple times in the show where he's expecting them to recognize that he's disabled, but he never tells anyone he's disabled, and so nobody treats him like he's disabled. And the thing is about that is, especially as someone with disabilities, as much as those accommodations are necessary in order for us to function, it is technically nobody else's responsibility to make sure we get those accommodations. If we are of sound mind, obviously there's external circumstances. If someone is required, I will say this, it's nobody's job except the disabled person or their caretaker to make sure that they're getting the accommodations that are necessary. So if they don't make a point to specifically request those accommodations, or to make it known that those are necessary, then it is accurate that no one else has to accommodate them if they don't want to. And that's something that is both real about the show and kind of not real about the show, because it is frustrating that they never just say it out loud. But it's also like Monk was created at a time when people who had these disorders but could cope with them for the most part didn't want to admit they were disabled because they would be looked at as less than, and it was like internalized ableism. That being said, a version of OCD that I saw when I was a kid, and it was actually the thing that made me think I had OCD, and like convinced me that I should go see a therapist and like get analyzed for it, is an episode of Scrubs. It was guest starring Michael J. Fox, and I forget what it was called. I call it the Super Doc episode, but I think depending on what platform you watch it on, it has a different name. But in this episode, Michael J. Fox, who I think at this point had already come out with, was it Lou Gehrig's disease? No, Parkinson's disease. When I first saw this episode, it got me to thinking about the things that I've had to deal with. The part that I connected with the most was the ending. At the end of this episode, Michael J. Fox has finished surgery, and the hospital's like in its night shift now, and he's still there. He's been there for like 3 hours, just washing his hands. And that was something that registered with me, even though at the time I didn't know what OCD was yet, because there were these things that I would do that in my head I had to do to make myself comfortable, and it was always very hard for me to explain to people because I didn't know why I needed those things to happen. I understood the frustration of like having to do this thing, and for some reason to you it seems normal, but to everyone else it seems really weird, and because of that they keep questioning or interrupting you, and you just don't have the tools to explain why it's necessary. So that's what jump-started the idea in my head that I might have OCD. And later, I think a couple years later, I talked with my mom, who at the time was already like thinking that I had autism because of a different movie. But we talked and I got analyzed and I was diagnosed with both. Rewatching that episode as an adult, there's actually a lot more nuance that I never noticed before. There's something about Scrubs that is very like of its time, but at the same time, like there's this weird kind of overlapping feeling that the writer understands that he is a privileged white straight man. He tells a lot of the stories from JD's point of view specifically because that's his point of view, but at the same time he acknowledges that the other point of views exist. You know, he still writes JD as oblivious and ignorant in certain scenes, but he still makes a point of accurately, in my opinion, depicting like the reaction from the other side. And he's like, well, that is understandable. Like if that's how it was explained to him. And it makes more sense. And so when I'm rewatching this episode and how the writer wrote the other characters around Michael J. Fox, how they act with him seems accurate. Like it seems like somebody who just doesn't understand neurodivergency yet. And even Dr. Cox specifically, like behind Michael J. Fox's back, like looks down on him for his disability internally. He doesn't recognize that he's doing it, but he's putting him it's I don't know what the equivalent or I don't know what the opposite of putting someone on a pedestal would be, but that's what he's doing to this guy. He's looking at him as lesser because he's disabled and because it affected him in school when they were interns together. And everyone else like has a genuine, like, as someone with OCD, I've experienced those people reacting like that to me in my life. And so for me, it was very accurate. Like, people at first approach them with, like, kitty gloves because they don't understand, like, how severe it is or how to interact with someone. They've never interacted with someone disabled before. Or they look at it as a superpower, and then at the end you realize it's not a superpower. It's a huge detriment to his everyday life that he managed to cope through, but that he still has to deal with. It's not a superpower. Rewatching the episode like 10 years later with the understanding that Michael J. Fox is disabled and that he had already come out as disabled by the time he did this performance makes the nuance of his character a lot better, because there's scenes where in every scene where he's seen as impressive to the other characters, he acknowledges that he's good at what he does. He acknowledges that because of how he had to learn, he comes off as a lot more talented than all the other doctors, and that's why they look at him like he has a superpower, but he never rubs it in anyone's face. He acknowledges it because he worked hard for it, but he never like makes anyone feel bad for not being as good as him. And he even like you can see that he actively tries to interact with everyone as friendly as possible, because he's not trying to rub it in anyone's face. He's not trying to be better than anyone else. He's just trying to do what he was called in to do. And that's a lot more relatable to me now as an adult, because it's a thing that I've had to go through as well, where it's like you have to try twice as hard as everyone else just to prove that you're able to function at the same level of everyone else. And because of that, when you exceed that, they, for some reason, get offended because now they look at your disadvantage as an advantage they don't have. They look at it as a superpower, and they use it as a reason to mistreat you. And that happens in the episode until the very end of the episode when they realize it's not a superpower. And I know I already said that, but it's a bigger point to me now that I'm an adult. Like, he knows the truth about his disability, but he doesn't let that fall on anyone else. He never makes that anyone else's fault. And whenever they ask questions, he answers honestly and he answers bluntly, but outside of them actively asking about his disability, he tries to function the best that he can just as himself. And that's something that I relate to a lot more. There's a scene where it's made to look visually quirky, like it's made to be played off as a joke, but they're at a bar and he has the thing about air exposure. So every time he takes a drink of his beer, he puts a coaster on it. Then he removes the coaster, takes a drink, puts a new coaster on it. And that seems quirky from an outside perspective, but now that I've lived with my disability for a long time, there's a nuance to that neurotypical people won't understand, is that's how he copes with being outside. He doesn't want to be outside, but he wants to have friends. And you can actively see him throughout the episode trying to function at this hospital and kind of struggling with it. And that's where his OCD manifests. It's not manifesting because he's quirky, it's manifesting because he's struggling, but he's coping as best as he can. And so it's like, that silly thing that he's doing with the coasters is the best possible scenario for him in that moment in his life. Like, if that had been 20 years earlier, he would not be able to step into a grungy dive bar and talk to complete strangers and feel comfortable because he has OCD. That's, in his mind, progress. He can have a beer with someone even if it looks weird to them. And so that's why I think that's a really good... And I know that Michael J. Fox doesn't have OCD, but you can also see and physically how he reacts to people's comments. He doesn't acknowledge them when they're underhanded, and he accepts them when they're complimentary, without rubbing it in anyone's face, because Michael J. Fox has had to live with that. Even though it's not OCD, he has had to live with disability. And now that I'm an adult, I understand that that's taken from personal experience. And so that's why I thought that was a really cool episode. Rewatching that, I'd like to see more interpretations of disability that are like that are more accurate. And that's honestly why a lot of people in various disabled communities ask that when there's a character that has a specific disability, it's why they push to have that person played by someone with that disability, because it's just a lot more genuine. Like, I saw Superstore, and I'm not paraplegic, I'm not quadriplegic, I'm not missing any limbs, but there's a character who's in a wheelchair in that show, and I've seen that guy in a bunch of other stuff, and even though he got used to the wheelchair, it doesn't look genuine. And I can't really put my finger on it right now, but he looks like someone who learned how to use a wheelchair when he moves around in it. He does not look like someone who's had to use a wheelchair for a large portion of their life. And that's the thing about when non-disabled people play disabled characters, is there's just a slight tinge of disingenuousness because they don't actually understand what it's like to be like that. Even if it's a method actor who was playing a blind guy, so he blindfolded himself for 3 months. It's okay, but that's not a thing you have to do. Something you chose to do so that you can try to empathize with the character, which is understandable and appreciated, but it's also, that's 3 months. That's not your entire life, Or it's people that play autistic characters or people who play characters with OCD. It's never going to be 100% genuine because they don't actually understand what it's like. I don't know if Dominic was the one that told me this, but I think I've heard of actors with OCD that have just never played someone with OCD. I think you told me Dimitri Martin has some form of OCD. Yeah. The comedian. And you can kind of see that in how he acts. I just think that there are people who actively act in Hollywood who have these disabilities and just don't talk about it, that could give a more accurate interpretation. And it's literally just being open-minded about giving those people a chance. But anyway, I I'm trying to figure out how I should end this. I was like super excited to talk about Scrubs, and I think that took up the bulk of the episode. For anyone who's following me that has OCD or following the podcast, the Un Poquito podcast, I guess I can also talk about like how I've overcome a lot of my fears. There's some that I still are kind of debilitated by. Like I have a very extreme fear of heights and flying, so I've literally never been on a plane, and it actively affects my ability to travel outside of my state because it's just a lot more like convenient for it's the thing, you know, whenever we made family trips, we had to plan around me because I refused to fly. And it's a thing that like as an adult, I actively am still against it. I'm not at that point yet where I'm comfortable flying. Or, I don't like roller coasters. And this is the thing, I've been on several roller coasters in my life. I absolutely hate being on roller coasters. And I don't think I ever want to be on one again. But it's a thing that's like unfortunate, you know, when I go to somewhere like Six Flags or Knott's Berry Farm, that's the only thing people want to do. And so I become the guy that holds everyone's stuff, not because I want to, but because there's like literally, it's not even like that's fair to me. It's, you know what I mean? Like, if I didn't go with them to that trip, they would have found a way to deal with their stuff. They give me that job because that's how they can be comfortable with bringing me along. But it's like, or we could do some of the things I want to do. You know what I mean? Like when I go to Disneyland, I want to see like the Star Wars world and like I want to see the events there. You know, there's like art shows there and there's bands there and there's like big performances there that have nothing to do with roller coasters. And I almost never get to see them when I go to Disneyland because no one I'm with ever wants to look at that stuff. They just want to go to Big Bear or go to Magic Mountain? That's not Disneyland. That's the other one. What's the one with the train at Disneyland? Matterhorn. You know, and so it's frustrating. So one thing I could give as advice, if you're asking, I know I'm not a professional, but I am someone who has the disorder, is be more confident and understanding what you need and what your boundaries are. You know, I know that's like a tall order to ask for some people because it is like an anxiety disorder. But what I mean is like know what you like and know what you don't like. And even if you're not ready to handle certain things and that like might offend some people, understand that just like they can choose not to accommodate you, you can choose not to interact with them. You don't need to deal with that in your life. Even if it's your close family, you don't have to go with them on family trips if it's going to result in you having a panic attack. You don't have to do the things that they want you to do just because they get frustrated with you. And if they can't meet you halfway and understand that it's just not something you're ready for, you don't have to interact with them at all. And they will just have to deal with the fact that that's something they have to do if they want to interact with you. What I'm saying is that the bridge of accommodation between people with disabilities and people without is just understanding. They don't have to accommodate you if they don't want to, but if they want to interact with you, whether it's for work or or if it's personal, like social or romantic interaction, if they want to be involved with you in any way, then they have to understand that those things are necessary for you to function with them. And that's kind of that's the give and take of having disability and interacting without disability. So just have confidence in that. Even if you can't have, even if you have the anxiety that comes with OCD, I would say have confidence in your understanding of your OCD and what you need for yourself. Thank you for joining me on this first episode. I hope you guys like it. The next 2 episodes will also be about my other disorders for now. I am going to talk about more stuff in the future. I felt like I need to make these ones my first episodes because they're very important to me. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe, hit the bell. Make sure you follow Un Poquito on our other page. And we'll see you guys next time.